Thanks, Las Kim Corla, and maybe I also just might take the opportunity to offer my condolences and sympathies to the family of Emma Vicnahuna on the day of her funeral, and apologies that I couldn't make along to the service, but there was also a centenary celebration for the victims of the RMS Leinster out in Dunleary this morning, so I had to attend that. But I think all of us across the country owe her a debt of gratitude for her courage and bravery in speaking out about people who are the victims of the cervical cancer scandal. But obviously, most importantly, it's a terrible, sad day for her family and friends, so I just want to offer my sympathies and condolences on that. I also have to express some disappointment that the Minister for Finance has just left. He wasn't around yesterday for many of the contributions on his budget, and he again won't be around for many of the contributions from the same section of the Dáil.
Seems to be what happens when we speak.
And that's, I suppose, kind of says it all, really, that yeah, well, thank you, John. But you see, the problem is that the respect of the government only extends to what they see as the political establishment, and it doesn't extend to the forces outside that establishment, even though on many of the critical issues that are facing this country at the moment, frankly, those who are not part of the establishment have played the key role in trying to mobilise forces to offer alternative approaches to deal with some of the most pressing crises we face. Most notably, and I'll talk about this in the most detail, on the housing crisis, as many of us were part of organising and mobilising for the huge Raise the Roof protest that took place last week, and the Dáil motion that was put forward in here and passed indeed by the Dáil, seeking radical measures to deal with the absolutely appalling housing and homelessness emergency. Something that, again, those of us not in the establishment predicted 5 or 6 years ago, warned against that was going to happen. But the government don't even have, you know, the humility to say they got it wrong and maybe we should just listen a little bit to those who actually warned us this was coming down the line. But, you know, what is it? The more things change, the more things stay the same, and that seems to be the watchword of the political establishment in this country. But however, we'll continue. And maybe eventually, but mostly I think with continuing to mobilise the resistance outside this Dáil to the failed policies of this government to address the really serious issues that face our society and our citizens, that we will actually force the government eventually to listen, or push them and the political establishment that has failed them out of the way to bring in a new dispensation in this country which puts the needs of people ahead of the privileged profit-hungry elites that seem to actually dominate the priorities of Irish society. This budget needed to be, desperately needed to be, a budget that addressed the social emergency that is the housing and homelessness crisis. It needed to be a budget that addressed the disaster in our public health service. It needed to be a budget that dealt with the existential threat of climate change. It needed to be a budget that dealt with the serious crisis in our education system. It needed to be a budget that dealt with the growing inequality and deprivation in Irish society. Instead, it was a budget of deception, trying to fool the people that the government were trying to address those problems, and it was a budget, not, as some said, an election budget. It was a budget to avoid an election. An effort by the two major parties to avoid an election and quell the growing discontent about the housing emergency, the health crisis, climate change, and so many of the other inequalities and injustices that reign in our society. But most significantly, it needed to be the budget that addressed the housing crisis, and it failed catastrophically in that regard. And instead, what we got was deception. Playing with numbers in order to deceive people into believing that the government was taking the issue seriously and was responding to, the heart-rending story told by Amanda on the radio the other day, or in my constituency, Terry O'Reilly, the soldier, a woman in her 30s who'd served this state for 8 years and is now sleeping in a car in Shankill, and so many others like her, last count Corla. Behind every one of the horrible statistics that index the housing crisis are human beings, families, and the terrible stories and hardships that they are enduring. And that is a huge number of people. It's a huge number of people. 10,000 people in emergency accommodation and 4,000 children, 140,000 families on the housing list, 70,000 families in serious mortgage distress, and as is now becoming apparent, when you see the young people on the Take Back the City protests, a whole generation of young people who are now despairing that they will ever be able to just have the elementary requirement of an affordable, secure roof over their head. Even if they get a job, even if they get educated, get a job, that they will not be able to afford a place to live. What an indictment of the failure of this government and the political establishment, that as we move into the 21st century, we have still not resolved problems that people like James Connolly were fighting when he was fighting the slum conditions endured by working class people at the turn of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, that we can't even do that. And rather than acknowledge that problem and take the radical action necessary to deal with this appalling human tragedy that is the housing emergency, as I said, we got deception and smoke and mirrors from the government in terms of what is in this budget to address that crisis. And the way the game is played is by making comparisons which deceive you as to what the government are actually doing in the budget. So the headline is to say, oh, there's much more than 400 million than there was in 2018. But is there much more than was already promised for 2019 in the Rebuilding Ireland programme? And of course, there is not at all much more. What was actually already in the Rebuilding Ireland programme is all that you have delivered in the budget. Just the resources necessary to deliver what you had already promised. Resources already pre-committed and indeed outlined in the department, the deeper paper on social housing output, which was produced in the summer. That's what's actually in the budget, stuff already pre-committed. And to answer the sort of mystery in terms of the figures that Deputy Coppinger alluded to, I spent this morning and last night trying to study the figures to say, how could you have this claim of all this extra money, but it doesn't actually seem to materialise into anything different in terms of what is actually going to be delivered in housing. And that is the case, because again, the deeper paper on housing is informative, because it just neatly tables what was already in Rebuilding Ireland. So yesterday the Minister said we're going to get 10,000 new social housing units to the stock in 2019. But that was in Rebuilding Ireland 3 years ago. And the only difference is that the figure in Rebuilding Ireland was 9,540. So all that we have additional is 460. So the big trumpeting of the housing budget and Fianna Fáil's success, presumably in trying to get more resources from the government, actually means the target has gone from 9,540 to 10,000. That's not even scratching the surface of the problem we're facing, but it gets worse. Because where are the 640 coming? Is that even new? No, the 640 that brings it up to 10,000 is part 5. It's in the small print of the budget document. It's stuff we hope to get off the private sector in the Part 5 arrangements. In other words, already this was included in the targets. So in terms of new, actual public housing stock, not a single extra house beyond what you'd already promised. And the key thing is, those original promises cannot address the crisis. Because you are relying on the private sector to address about 80% of the deficit in public and affordable housing. Because your own targets say you need 137,000 social housing units, and in Rebuilding Ireland, the vast majority of that is to be delivered through RAS and HAPS. The exact figures being 83,000 HAPS tenancies and 3,800 HAPS tenancies. So the vast bulk of what you hope is going to resolve the crisis is to be delivered through the private sector, reliance on private landlords, corporate property speculators like Iris REIT, like Cerebus, like Kennedy Wilson, like Cairn Homes, all these people who bought land and property from NAMA, from the state, from the people at discount prices, and are now going to charge the state an arm and a leg to rent it or lease it back to them. And it is going to be a massive black hole in the public finances, which is going to grow exponentially over the coming years, but will not actually address the housing crisis, because these people can pull out of those arrangements at a moment's notice, leaving the state with absolutely nothing. With absolutely nothing at all. And the headlines, Minister McGrath, they say it everything. Here's just a few random headlines which really tell the story of what's going on in housing. Cairn Homes profits jump 191%. Cairn Homes founders receive 61.4 million in share awards. Profits of Iris REIT more than doubled during the first half of 2018. Cerebus just paid €70,000 tax on Irish profits of 20 million. Profits soar at one of Ireland's most well-known developers, Park Developments. And you can go through the list. Just Google profits, property speculators, and you'll get all these headlines. That's what's actually going on. An absolute obscene fortune being made by these people that the government, Fine Gael and specifically Michael Noonan, handed over 40 billion worth of NAMA assets to these people at a song which they are now going to charge the state an absolute fortune for, not to mind the extortionate rents that they are charging to tenants. And again, to allude to the story which I told yesterday about Iris REIT and the Sandyford residents, that I went up there last week to find these people being charged for Iris REIT looking for a 25 to 30% increase in the rent, exploiting loopholes that you lot left in the residential tenancies legislation. That is what is going on. And against that background, then you bring in a new tax relief for the landlords. Mortgage interest, 100% mortgage interest tax relief on on borrowings they make to either purchase property or to refurbish property. Now, this is absolute scandal. You're actually providing, the public is going to pay to incentivise people to speculate on property. And to increase rents and to evict people. And I really want to underline this point. You see, it sounds good in theory, doesn't it? Let's give a tax break to the landlord to fix up the property. Except when you discover that fixing up the property is one of the main loopholes which is allowing the landlords to go above the 4% rent caps, and indeed to evict tenants. To say, oh, we have to do very substantial refurbishments, you've got to leave. We had to fight a case in my area over this with Apollo Global Management. Another one of these big asset managers bought an apartment block from NAMA, and then all of the tenants get letters saying, we're doing substantial refurbishments, you got to go. Now, we fought that. The residents got organised and fought it, and we won the case, but Huge numbers of people don't know they can fight, don't have the confidence to, and even in that case, many of the residents have subsequently left because they know Apollo Global Management are just looking for the next excuse to get them out. So they leave because they can't bear the insecurity and worry of knowing that the people who own the property are trying to drive them out. But of course, there are huge numbers of other people are just being driven out. Because of these tactics of these vulture funds. So it's an absolute scandal. It's an absolute scandal, Minister. And what makes it all the worse then is we're going to pay these people additional. You know, one of the I said that the extra figure allocated by the government for housing is not what it seems, but the bulk of it is going to be a 121 million increase in what we're going to pay out in HAPs. But it's not going to deliver even a single extra HAP tenancy. As bad as inadequate as HAPs is, you'd think if we pay out an extra 121 million in HAPs payments, we might get a few extra HAPs tenancies. But no, the Minister confirmed yesterday that the 121 million, which will be added to the existing 300 million, will deliver, this is what he said in his speech, 16,760 HAP tenancies in 2019. How many tenancies were promised in Rebuilding Ireland for 2019? 16,760. So we're going to pay an extra 121 million to get the same number of tenancies that were already promised. Now what's happening there? I'll tell you what's happening. We are now having to budget an extra 120 million because they're jacking up the rents that they are charging the state to rent the same number of tenancies. They are extorting the state. And we have assisted them in doing it and provided them with tax breaks on all of it in the form of Section 1110 tax relief, which is beyond a scandal. Beyond a scandal. And I hope someone starts to investigate what's going on in Section 1110, because again, as I said yesterday, we don't even know how much tax is foregone on that. The last thing, and just in a minute I have, I'll move on from housing. Well, just to say, I mean, how could we address all this rather than just critique it? The way we could address it is we have 114,000, enough land in Narma and the local authorities to build 114,000 houses. If we put the money that's just been put in the rainy day fund, €2 billion into additional capital expenditure, we could deliver 20,000 council houses every year starting next year on public land. We could also, by the way, fast track the delivery of Part 5, which is never going to come because a lot of the people who've got planning permissions, the government boasts about planning permissions, says, well, there's loads of planning permissions, but what they're doing is they're getting planning permission, inflating the value of the property, but not actually building anything. So we never get the Part 5 social housing element that we're going to get. How could we address that? Take the land now. As soon as they get the planning permission, grab the 10%, which by the way should be 20%, grab the land now and build on it now. And you could get even more than 20,000 that we would build on our own land. And obviously we need to freeze rents and freeze evictions until we begin to provide the public and affordable housing that we actually need. Just one last point in the last 20 seconds, last Chairman, I do want to comment on education. What you've done in further education, or not done in further education, is an absolute scandal. Irish universities are tumbling down the international rankings, right? This is a very serious issue for the long-term future of this country, for its reputation and so on, and even for your beloved foreign direct investment. Our education system is declining. We're going to take 18,500 extra students into the system next week. The increase in further education funding was 1%, about €13 million extra, which means the actual public subsidy per student in further education is going to decline and decline significantly. I got a letter, I'll finish on this last Count Corla, I got a letter this morning from the Association of Universities saying this was one of the big scandals of the budget. Is that given the dramatic increase of student numbers in third level education, your failure to add additional funds into third level education means there's going to be a further decline in the quality of third level education next year and in the years following. Even the government, even Fine Gael, should consider that a pretty serious concern.